I have two words for us today. Righteous indignation. According to the source of all truth on the internet, it is defined as anger that is primarily motivated by a perception of injustice or other profound moral lapse. It further states that in some Christian doctrines, it is considered the only form of anger which is not sinful. According to these doctrines, an example of righteous anger would be when Jesus drove the money lenders out of the temple. Now, there's a pretty important caveat to that definition. Righteous indignation is supposed to be distinguished from anger that is prompted by something more personal, like an insult. But that distinction is often overlooked or ignored altogether. For instance, consider a few years ago, and there's a lot of uproar about giving some modest student loan relief to those below a certain income level. Many decried it as unfair because they had to pay off their own loans. So why should taxpayers pay them off for others? There were also those that said that borrowers knew they agreed to pay it back, and so they should have to. However, at the same time, many of these same critics didn't complain about loans which were given out to businesses during the darkest times of the pandemic, which were nearly universally forgiven. Nonetheless, these critics were driven by what they considered to be a sense of righteous indignation. And yet, I'd say in reality, it was not a sense of actual injustice driving those reactions. Instead, it touches on what is a key point in today's gospel passage. Fairness and justice are not the same thing. Our gospel reading today is among the most familiar. We heard that Jesus was spending time with tax collectors and sinners. This angered many among the Pharisees and the scribes. So Jesus told them a parable. A rich man had 2 sons, and the younger came to him and asked for his share of the inheritance right away. The father did it, the son left, and lived imprudently. He then realized he had little choice but to return home and asked to be treated as one of his father's servants. The younger son came near home, and the father saw him, ran to him, and embraced him. The older son, who'd stayed and worked, was mad at his father for doing this. And very angry when he saw the big party going on. So the father went out to him, asked why he wasn't partying. And the father told him, "We had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found." First, I have to share something that I was astounded that I didn't learn until this past week. We all likely know this passage as the prodigal son. Until now, I'd never done something that seems pretty obvious. Look up the actual definition of the word prodigal. Well, I did. And it doesn't mean what many of us probably likely think it means. There are two main definitions for the word as an adjective. Spending money or using resources freely and recklessly, wasteful, extravagant, or having or giving something on a lavish scale. For some reason, I had always kind of thought of prodigal as meaning something that had been lost and loved, but had come back. Because, well, that's the meaning of the story. And so earlier, when somebody said the prodigal daughter has returned, I cautioned them because of the actual meaning of the word. So now that we actually know the meaning of the word prodigal, or the possible meanings, what does it actually mean in this story? As I said, we know the story as the prodigal son. Prodigal in that the younger son was wasteful in his spending and lifestyle. And that fits with the first definition of prodigal. However, there is another. Another way of looking at this passage is that it's not the son, the younger son, that is prodigal. It is the father. The father was not spending freely and recklessly. Instead, he was giving something on a lavish scale. And that something was not resources. It's not clothing, jewelry, or shoes, nor was it the celebration. The thing that the father was giving was forgiveness and mercy. Remember the context of the parable. Jesus was hanging out with many religious elites. Jesus was hanging out with those whom the religious elites thought were sinners, like tax collectors. They grumbled and complained that Jesus would dare spend time with people like them. This was righteous indignation, at least in their own minds. They thought that it was a profound injustice and a moral lapse for this gifted teacher to consort with sinners. But they were wrong. In reality, the religious leaders likely thought that Jesus should instead be spending time with them. So they were being the most human of things, jealous. Again, the context is key. Jesus was trying to let these Pharisees and scribes know that fairness and justice are not the same things. And the Father here obviously represents God. And the Father is generous with forgiveness and mercy on a lavish scale. And the Pharisees and scribes couldn't understand that sort of forgiveness. It was alien to them. Just like the idea of Jesus hanging out with sinners. The Pharisees made a mistake that we all do. We confuse our sense of fairness with what is just. But God doesn't work that way. Fairness is arbitrary, while justice is that which is true and morally right. And God is beyond fairness and even justice, because there's always room for that other thing: grace. The message that Jesus was getting at with the parable of the prodigal son is found in an alternative heading for this section of the gospel. In the Common English Bible, no, not the Message, but the Common English Bible, this section of chapter 15 of Luke is titled Occasions for Celebration. Jesus was telling the Pharisees, the scribes, and us that when others experience something good, we are to celebrate, not grumble. We're also subtly being reminded to know our place. We aren't the judges of others. God is. Our role is to strive to do better, to love one another, and to love God. And part of doing better is recognizing when we have done wrong. And when I first thought of the idea of righteous indignation, or at least the perception of it, I almost immediately thought of someone I used to know. As most of you know, my path toward ordination was not an easy one, nor a quick one. I began discerning the call to the priesthood officially in the fall of 1999, but wasn't ordained until January 2017. So when another young man began the process toward ordination, who'd only joined the Episcopal Church a few years earlier, and was going through pretty quickly, I took notice. It also happened to coincide with the fact that my mother happened to be on his discernment committee, so I heard a lot about it. And at one point, there was a paperwork hiccup, because the Episcopal Church loves its paperwork, as bureaucracies always do. There was no documentation of this young man having ever been baptized. And that's because his grandfather, Baptist preacher, had done it in a family creek or something, and so there was no documentation. And so this young man's response was, well, I'll just get baptized again. And at that point, my father, who is agnostic, said, isn't there something in a creed about one baptism? And indeed, my father was right. For more than 1,500 years, the Nicene Creed has talked about one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And that is where my righteous indignation kicked in. I thought, why can this young man be ordained when he seems to know so little about the basics of the church? And I can't. And it turned out my skepticism was a little bit warranted, A young man, after less than 5 years being an ordained Episcopal priest, left the church for an Anglican one. But at the same time, I was very wrong. I thought I knew better. I thought I was motivated by a sense of justice. But again, I was wrong. I was like the older son and felt entitled to something while another was not worthy. Today we are being reminded that we all make mistakes and that we are all sinners. Indeed, the Pharisees and scribes described the people that Jesus was hanging out with as sinners. But they failed to realize that they too were sinners. Now, nearly all of us at times can feel like we're motivated by a sense of righteous indignation from time to time. But in reality, it's often motivated by something else, like jealousy. Instead, today we are being told to rejoice when others receive good news. And we must remember that God is merciful, just, and gracious, but not necessarily fair. And that is very, very, very good news. And so, let us give thanks for God's infinite grace. And remember that we have been made new creations, which means we must continue to strive to love and serve one another, not judge one another. Amen.